Well, without any further ado, we've really come right back into it again. We're now moving away from the 7th century. At the end of the 7th century, we're right there from 685 to 705. This is the rule, or you might say 680. I think you would say it was 680 to 705. I know most scholars say it's 685 because they have Marwan, his father, before that. But you're actually pointing to some of the coins that suggest that he actually ruled before. What the scholars today are saying. And I think either way, it doesn't matter. al-Malik was a formidable force, and he is a huge kingpin in this whole context of the historical milieu that was going on at this period. And what better person than Thomas to really unpack it for us? So now we're going to move into our good friend al-Malik. Help us with him. Help us unpack him. You're going to be doing 2 different talks on this. One looking just at the structures that he introduced, like the Dome of the Rock. And then the second one will be looking at the inscriptions that were on those structures, especially the inscriptions of the Dome of the Rock, because you need to read those inscriptions to understand who he was attacking and what he was confronting, because not only because of his importance, but it is this material that feeds its way into the Quran. So over to you. God bless you. Thanks for coming and helping us out, Thomas.
Right. Thank you, Jay. And yeah, let's not waste any time and jump straight into today's episode. We're now in section 4 of my presentation, and call this a new religion, because now we're getting into the area where this new religion evolves, but we're not there yet. So that's why the first part I called al-Malik and Muhammadanism, because I don't want to call it Islam, because it's not Islam yet. It's the idea of Jesus being the Muhammad, the praised one or the blessed one. But before we go into al-Malik, we quickly have to look again at what happened before. And that was that Muawiyah, who came before al-Malik, his goal was to possess authority over Christendom in the East. Muawiyah was actually the first, caliph in quotation marks, because he wouldn't have called himself caliph. And he left us behind this inscription, which I think we've seen before, but I just want to mention it quickly again, wherein he is sort of introduced as the person who rebuilt these hot baths in Hamad Gadel, and where we also see for the first time the Arab calendar. And the inscription starts with a cross in the very top left. So that's also an indication that Muawiyah, of course, was also a Christian, like most of the Arabs back then. And on this inscription, while it does establish a calendar, there's no mention of the Hijra. Instead, it calls it the year of the Arabs. So 622 is the year of the Arabs. And Robert Kerr, he actually argues that Hijra is derived from the well-attested Syriac root HJR of Magharai. So that's the Hagarenes. So he says that the year of the Hijra is actually just the Arab equivalent of the Syriac year of the Arabs, because it's the year of the Hagarenes. And that's where the Hijra comes from, which is the beginning of the calendar. And we've seen, as we've seen before, that's because that's when the Hagarenes gained their independence. However, the authority of the Arabians suffered from a limited legitimacy due to this separation of spiritual and secular power. The Iranian National Church, so that's the Church of the East, the Nestorian Church, was rejected in the West. The Armenians, Syrian, Jacobites, and Egyptian Copts practiced monophysitism. And then we had also Greek Orthodox Christians there. And there was just big divisions within this new caliphate, if you will. And we also, of course, had those pre-Nicene anti-Trinitarian Christians in the mix as well, of whom al-Malik is one. So now let's go to this change then from Muawiyah to al-Malik. And now I want to quote Volker Popp real quick. He said, quote, "After the unexpected failure at Constantinople and the retreat of autumn 674, the opposition to Muawiyah came together. First, Abdullah of the family al-Zubayr was elected leader of the faithful. His coins minted in Darabshirt begin in the year 672. Okay, end quote. And now in comes al-Malik. And well, so this map I've put here it may not be too, also you shouldn't rely on it too much. This is very crude, if you will. But what we do see is that Muawiyah still had his power base in the West. Even though al-Zubayr was in Persia and Kirman mainly, that was his power base, and he kept it also for quite some time. Then in comes al-Malik from the east, but we don't really know how this transition happened. Whether he toppled Muawiyah, whether he was just the legitimate successor and Muawiyah died, or what happened. So the historical record doesn't tell us, unfortunately. But what al-Malik did was he introduced this new Christian movement, and his intent was to unite all the Christians in his Arabian Empire. And the movement was announced by the demand that an understanding of Jesus as the Muhammad be adopted. And this demand was preceded by another, namely that Jesus be conceived as Abdallah, the servant of God, which we've also seen before. But this Muhammadan motto was supposed to be a leitmotif for the Christian theology in the Orient against the Byzantine Empire. Muawiyah's loss to the Byzantine Empire, and especially the resulting tributary payments, discredited him with the other Arabs. And that's sort of why it was really important to now establish this strong presence there. The confessions of the Muhammad formula can be found on many dated and undated coins from the region of Arabian rule in both East and West eventually. So we've seen it start in the East, move to the West, but then eventually was everywhere. Again, I want to quote Volker Popp because he puts it nicely. So, quote, "If the reign of Muawiyah stood for a continuation of Iranian militaristic expansion under the leadership of a new elite, and by means of preservation of the status quo and the abilities of religious communities to live together, then the arrival of al-Malik signaled an entirely new perspective. Syrian religious conceptions returned to the place of their birth after a nearly 200-year exile following the flight of their defenders into the Sassanian East." So Muawiyah was basically, he saw himself more like the successor of the Persian King of Kings, right? So he wasn't Persian anymore, so he was an Arab, but he wanted to sort of continue in their tradition. Whereas al-Malik came in and he said, no, we need something completely new, or something that's uniting both East and West. And it's going to be this Muhammadan Christianity. So in 681, that's the first, when the first coins with al-Malik as the ruler were minted. He takes over as the caliph. And the reason why he, like many historians, reject this date is because the standard Islamic narrative tells them to do so, but the coins don't lie, basically. And to get the way around it, they say, well, those coins that disagree with the narrative, they have a different dating system, and the ones that do agree, they have the dating according to the Arabs. Yeah, in reality, that doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Can you just explain that?
You come to history this way.
Can you explain what you've just said there? Some people were confused by that. What do you mean by the different systems here? Just explain that real quickly. We do need this because people did put that up there. They were a little confused.
Exactly. So the dating according to the Arabs starts in the year 622. So if we have a coin with the year 60, we go forward 60 years. Or actually, it's 59, because they always say in the 60th year, which is in our counting 59 years. So we go forward 59 years from 622, and then we arrive at 681, which is earlier than what the standard Islamic narrative tells us al-Malik to have taken the reign. So what the historians who go with the standard Islamic narrative, what they say is that on those specific coins that disagree with the standard Islamic narrative, they assume that the dating is according to the Persian dating system, which always goes with the infinitization of the king. And the last Persian king got onto the throne in the year 634, which is 12 years later. So if we start counting in the year 634, then the year 60 would mean we are now in 693. So that's 12 years later, and that's now within the time period that the standard Islamic narrative tells us al-Malik to have been a ruler. But of course, the last Persian king was long dead, and no new successor was there. So it doesn't even make sense to count in the Persian way, because, there was no Persian king to count from.
Which you also say,
also that people do accept. Sorry?
They hated the Persians, so why would they be using a Persian dating?
There's that, yeah. And sometimes you accept the Arab dating system, and sometimes you don't. That doesn't make any sense. You have to have some kind of standard and then follow it through. But yeah, that's why Volker Popp and others are saying, yeah, well, actually it was 681 that al-Malik got into power, and with him also came the Muhammad motto into the West. Now, if one more quote, al-Malik had recognized that further victories against his confessional enemies could only occur if the military efforts were accompanied by an internal consolidation. Thus, he put the emphasis of his own work on the development of ideological armament. His goal was to unify under the banner of the Muhammad motto. So he was smart enough to see that the empire under Muawiyah was too fractured, and he needed to have like a common identity. So he focused on internal consolidation at first. And this was facilitated by the Arabization of his empire, which he also pushed, right? So one identity for his empire, which included this Arabization. And we've seen when we looked at the timeline how in the 9th century there were barely any Aramaic speakers left, whereas before this whole area was full of Aramaic speakers. Right? That's the result of al-Malik's Arabization policy, which was then continued by his successors. And he used coins to advertise his ideology, obviously. Now, we come to the Dome of the Rock. And this is important because this is also the very first large-scale religious building that was constructed by these new Arab rulers. So, and then they chose as the first building, this Dome of the Rock, they chose the location very carefully, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And that's what I want to get into a bit more now. And now I have a last quote by Volker Popp, I promise. So he says, quote, al-Malik was certain that din as a contractual system for the relationship between God and humanity had Islam as its prerequisite. Naturally, this demand did not relate to the individual behavior of the faithful, but rather to the behavior of the community of the faithful. A community dispersed and divided could not stand before the one God. A contract was not possible with this type of community. Consequently, the conflict over the interpretation of Scripture had to end, and agreement had to be reached concerning its understanding. The community of the faithful had to be of a quality that reflected the idea of Allah as-Samad, so that's the supreme provider. The idea of the one God demanded that one community as its counterpart in a contractual relationship, and this one community had to be shaped by a unified understanding of Scripture. Consequently, this religious duty, din, as a result of a contract with God, is the restoration of the broken contract and is effected through renewed submission under the contract. This then would ultimately also lead to a unified understanding of Scripture. End quote. And then this is the last quote, I promise, at least from Volker Popp. So the Dome of the Rock was sort of built as a monument of this new contract. It was built in opposition to the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It was sort of the counterpoint to them. It is the new temple, the temple of the new Zion. It's the symbol of the Muhammadan Christianity and the new rulers. It contains also the new creed with Jesus as the Muhammad, which we will look in a later episode, or actually in the next one. But first, I also want to go into this symbolism that the Temple Mount had. And for that, I want to go to the Christian book of the Cave of Treasures, which was a Aramaic book, which contains various narratives related to the Christian Bible. So it's an apocryphal book. It was probably written around the turn from the 6th to the 7th century in northern Mesopotamia. And al-Malik was likely familiar with these legends. And there's one part in there it's all about the rock, basically, this book. But I want to highlight this one bit from this book, which goes, at this location, so that's the Temple Mount, at this location, the cross of the Messiah was erected. There grew a tree which bore the lamb that saved Isaac. This place is the center point of the earth, the grave of Adam, the altar of Melchizedek, Golgotha, the place of the skull, Gabbatha. There David saw the angel bearing the fiery sword. There Abraham presented his son Isaac as a burnt offering. There he saw the Messiah and the cross and the salvation of our Lord Adam. So we can see that there were legends building around the Dome of the Rock. So this was now believed by many to be the place of the crucifixion, for instance. And well, you've heard the list. So everything of importance happened on the Dome of the Rock in this tradition, in this Syrian Christian tradition, which this book is a part of. So it's only logical that that's also the place where the very first monumental building would have been constructed by the Arabs who come from this tradition. Also, so the Dome of the Rock in Arabic is Kubat as-Saha, which, as Christoph Luxemburg points out, comes from Kupta in Aramaic, which is the cupola under which the body of a saint is stored, which is also related to the Arabic kuba, which is a mausoleum dedicated to a wali or saint. Saha is the rock. So this refers to the crypt underneath the rock. So there's a crypt underneath the rock, which, as we've just seen in this book of the Cave of Treasures, is believed to be the tomb of Adam. But it was also seen as a symbolic tomb of Christ. And that's something we need to keep in mind for one of the later episodes, because that will come up again. But of course, later Muslim scholars rejected these connections, and we'll also get into that.
Don't worry. Great. Listen, thanks. This is terrific. al-Malik is a main player. I'm so glad you've gone back to him. The Dome of the Rock is absolutely significant. The symbolism you're bringing, and it sits right there at the holiest place for Judaism, right above the Church of the Sepulchre. You've also brought in the idea that it was put there not only because it was in opposition to Constantinople, it was in opposition to the Byzantine. Listen, Byzantine, if you want to stop and think about it, Byzantine Christianity is really his biggest threat, is it not? Because not only is it theologically his biggest threat, but it's also politically his biggest threat. So what better way to thumb your nose at the Byzantines than to sit and at the Jews simultaneously, and then to put this building looking down onto the Church of the Sepulchre, bigger and better, the biggest building of its day, using Byzantine architecture to even construct it right on top of the Holy of Holies. This is where Abraham supposedly sacrificed, some believe it was Ishmael or Isaac, his son. This is where the temple was built. This is right there where the Holy of Holies. And of course, Jerusalem is where everybody goes to for pilgrimage. And that's why he didn't build it in Damascus. He put it there in Jerusalem. And of course, there was no Mecca yet, so he couldn't have built this in Mecca. It would have been symbolically, not only politically, but theologically, a thumbing your nose, a shutting down. And then, of course, what you're going to do in the next segment, I know where you're going with this. You're going to actually look and see what was written there. I mean, I get so tired of Muslims saying, Jay, you don't understand that the Dome of the Rock was built to commemorate the ascension to the seven heavens by Muhammad from going on the back of the winged horse called the Burak, going up there from Mecca up there to the Dome of the Rock, and where the rock is and ascending. That's what it is. And my comeback has always been, just look at the inscription, show me. I did a debate in 1998, I kid you not, with Sheikh Abdul Green there in London on the Dome of the Rock. And I was trying to introduce this, and he just laughed at me. He says, Jay, look at the southern portico. There's a reference to chapter 2 verse 149 to 150, which talks about the Qibla. Look at the dome itself. There's chapter 17, verse 1, which talks about this mirage. That's what it is. The mirage, the going to the seven heavens and going up to the seven heavens, coming back down again. She said it's right there. And I remember after the break, they had to go do their prayers. I came back and I said, Abdul Green, do you know when that portico was built? And do you know when the dome was built that you're looking at? That was built in 1876, a little over 100 years ago. You remember, the dome has been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. And only the inner ambulatories, those inner court two arches in the middle, are the only original part of the building that still stands today. And that's where the inscriptions are. And it's those inscriptions, not the ones that are on the facade of the outer side of the building that were built in the 1800s. You got to go back to those, because those are the original part. And that's what you're going to do next. Now, the fact that you are pinpointing al-Malik and you're showing that Muawiyah wanted to become, you introduced that. He introduces he goes again. I mean, Muawiyah is right there along with the Christian ideal. You have al-Malik who wants to introduce a brand new way of thinking. Not only does he want to introduce a brand new way of thinking, he also wants to make sure that Arabic is now the lingua franca for everybody. And that's why I hadn't thought this until you mentioned it. That's one reason why so many people didn't know Aramaic, because al-Malik did such a great job, which makes it even more problematic if you're going to then start putting the Quran together at this time, and you're introducing and you're borrowing from this Aramaic material. You better know your Aramaic to know what you're borrowing. Obviously, that's why so much went wrong later on, as we're going to get into. But you also went through and you did a little quick overview of why this dating of the Malik we need to be careful of, because it all depends on whether or not you're going to use Persian dating or you're going to use Arab dating. The standard Islamic narrative wants to impose on us that we use only the standard Islamic narrative. But with this, suddenly they use the Persian dating to try to help them out with the 60 years. You can't do it out of both sides of your mouth. You can't say one thing for one thing and one thing in another. You've got to be consistent. And it makes sense that this would be pointing back to the time of the Arabs, because he was trying to create this Arab identity. So you would obviously be using the same year that all the Arabs had looked to, because this is when Heraclius had destroyed the Persians and had given them their own identity. And that's why it makes sense now that this is probably 681. Thank you for that. That helps me out as well. But then now you're introducing the Dome of the Rock. Hugely important, because it's still there. This is the one building we can look at. This is still there. It has not been destroyed. It is almost as pristine today as the day it was built. It's one of the few treasures from the 7th century, because now we can have this building to look at. It has been a treasure for 1,400 years. That's why it's still standing, though it's been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. The inner part is that part. And what you're going to do next now is look at that inner part, aren't you? You're going to look at those ambulatories. Here, I'm just going to show you where the ambulatories are. We're just picking them up here right now. Where those green arrows are, that's what we're going to look at next. Because it's those inscriptions which were introduced by al-Malik, they're absolutely important. Because then we're going to see who this Muhammad is, or this Muhammadism, as you're calling it. We're going to see what this is all about and why this is significant, because this is beginning of what Islam then came to be. And thank you for this. This has been inspiring. This has been great. Can't wait for the next one, because this is where I start to salivate, because this is what I love, is this kind of material. We're getting to real hard evidence. Everything has been nothing. There's been nothing there for us to grab a hold on. I was just watching this interview by Dr. Robert Hoyland from January 3rd of this year, where he just said, when he was asked by apostate prophet, well, what existed? What was there? He said, absolutely nothing. Oh, up in the north and in the south, in the east, but nothing in the west, nothing there in the Hijaz. There's just nothing there. And that's why we've got to find out what was happening. But to do this, we're still not going to the Hijaz yet. We're not even anywhere near the Hijaz. Have you noticed? We're still way up in Jerusalem, 1,000 miles further north. We still got to go back to Jerusalem, and we've got to start to look and see what was al-Malik introducing. Great stuff. I can't wait. This is coming up next. Don't go away. Come back. We'll introduce this. Thanks so much, Thomas. Good to have you back on board. And listen, make sure you go to his channel. He's now putting up videos, these 3-minute videos. Follow through what he's doing there, because much of what he's doing in his videos on his channel actually support what we're doing here. This is much more advanced. That's more to get through and to find through how you understand the Arabic, because you have to understand the Arabic. You have to see the evolution of the Arabic, and that's what he's doing. Follow how he goes and evolves through the Arabic to understand then what the Quran became, because the Quran is Arabic, but to understand where that Arabic came from and how it evolved, only then will you understand then the problems with the Quran that we have today. God bless you so much. It's been good to have you. Put your comments below. This is our good friend Thomas and Jay, over and out.